Hey everyone, welcome to the Glad Trad podcast. I'm Rudy Carlos.
And I'm Jordan Pacheco.
And today we're joined by two special guests from down under. We have Thomas Massey and his cousin David. David Massey as well?
David, yes.
Okay.
We're related.
Ooh, yeah.
Same last name.
First cousins.
And Thomas has a really interesting podcast. He had us on a few weeks ago, which is the Lounge Room Chats with Thomas Massey. So check that out if you want to get some more of his content. Thomas and David, for those who aren't familiar with you, could you give us a brief introduction on who you are and what you do?
Sure, definitely. I'll jump in.
Thomas,
Tom, I'm a 27-year-old cradled Catholic from Brisbane, Australia. There's American heritage, American blood, American ancestry on my mother's side. So I'm a diehard Yank when I'm not Australian.
Having
said, live in Australia, so I love it. It's my home. I've got wonderful family. I'm honored to be joined by one of my cousins today on your show. What do you want to know about me? I consider myself to be sort of interesting, but a lot of people consider me to be boring. So what I would tell you might depend on what you want to know. David, what can we tell them?
Mm-hmm.
Well, you're a dual citizen.
I am a dual citizen.
You are an American citizen. So that's interesting.
Hey, brotherhood.
Come visit us.
Oh, heck. Yeah. Wouldn't that be nice? Wouldn't it be nice if the borders were open? There's a song in that, I think.
I just want to make an injection. The borders are open, but only if you don't want to do it in any sort of legitimate fashion. So if you want to just walk across, man, I mean, there's no more horses or anything to worry about. So you can.
Gotcha.
You're not likely to run into Kamala.
Far from.
Yeah. But no, you guys were correct, and thank you for the shout out for the podcast, the Lounge Room Chats. David works really closely with me on that, as does David's brother Michael. We've just sort of expanded. We're having a little bit of fun with it. We've got a beautiful website, The Catholic Corner, which is sort of the umbrella platform where we've got our podcast, a little bit of written content, and the video side to what goes on the podcast. But we love it. We're both very passionate Catholics, and that's probably something that we'll talk a little bit more about throughout the podcast. But I'm sure you'll find out more about both of us as you ask questions and we embarrass ourselves giving answers. Yeah. And so here's to that.
We made a mistake because we asked you to discuss yourself a little bit, but what we really should have done, Rudy, probably should have just asked David to tell us about Tom, because that would make a lot more sense. We want those first cousin deets. So David, tell us a little bit about yourself, because especially with Lounge Room Chats, and don't worry, we're definitely going to recommend all of our subscribers go ahead and check out the podcast and also the website too. The Catholic Corner is a great website, and I think a really good resource and belt for the traditional Catholic movement. David, you're more behind the scenes with this kind of thing. So why don't you tell us a little bit about where you're at, what your kind of story is in that kind of regard, because this is your 20 seconds of fame before we just kick everyone off. So
Sure. So I'm a bit older than Tom, so I'm 36. So when we were growing up, there was a bit of an age difference, and I can remember when, teasing, beating up on Tom, when I was the big cousin and he was the little toddler,
little cousin
fighter. Yeah. It's one of the great things about having a large family, and we all together, I think, have 25, or our grandparents had 5 sons and they had 25 children. So we all grew up in the same location there was 25 of us. And we were all very close as a family. It's great now growing up. I would never have said I was really close to Tom when we were younger, just because there was that age difference. But, grow up now, we're both adults, both Catholics who take that very seriously, and it's been great over the last couple of years to start working a bit closer with Tom on the lounge room chats. I think I was one of maybe the second person he interviewed, and I just got a call out of the blue saying, "Hey, I'm doing a podcast, and do you want to go on?" So it was
the first time I'd spoken to David in probably 20 years. Do you reckon?
Is that true?
Not quite.
Little bit of a joke.
Yeah.
But
yeah. So my involvement's been more so hoping to provide a little bit of input, a little bit of insight, a little bit of guidance behind the scenes. But I'm more a writer. So I do enjoy the writing side of things. I haven't gotten much content up on the website yet, but I do intend to start ramping that up a little bit. But for example, my dad and my brother are both writers as well, and they've both had content published at 1 Peter 5 and The Remnant, publications like that. So my specific family has a bit of a writing background, which where I enjoy. Yeah. So that's more so my involvement with Tom's podcast. And I've been visited by my youngest daughter here.
Oh, we're gonna pull a Taylor Marshall, Rudy. Let's see.
Oh, I might too. My baby needs a diaper change.
This not planned.
Yeah. I'm gonna make a quick slash here just for everyone's ease. So don't worry, we have unlimited minutes. And on top of that, I'm recording all of our audio separately. So don't worry if there's a stumble, there's one thing. Oh my gosh, she's beautiful. Beauty. Hello, madam.
Hi.
She currently has a cast on her leg.
Oh, poor girl. What happened?
But
kangaroo got her.
She broke her leg recently, but
Australia's dangerous.
Yeah. It was her brother that was dangerous.
Mm-hmm. Which actually, that actually gives us a good segue too, and we'll start with you, Tom. But you know, again, we were speaking a little bit before the show, but for us, really, genuinely, as well, there's 3 Yanks, I suppose, and David, I don't know what we're going to do with you, but genuinely, I think it's kind of interesting, really engaging, especially with fellow Catholics, people who we share a kind of the common heritage, common kind of historical kind of tropes with, even though we're, they might be the Canadians or the English or the Australians or something. So can you just give an overview with you, Tom? We're so used to kind of the Catholic conversations here in the United States. And, and for us, we have little echoes of what Catholicism is in all the other parts of the world. And it's not through lack of trying or anything. It's just, there's just so many regional battles that we're all just trying to settle. But starting with you, will you just tell us a little bit about what your upbringing in the Catholic faith has been? And if you, both of you, when it gets to it, can speak for an entire overview of not just a country, but a continent, but the state of Catholicism in Australia, because we hear a lot of chirpings, some of them very positive, then also stuff that sometimes is really kind of hard to fathom, specifically in parts of the United States.
Mm-hmm. That's such an interesting question, because that calls us into things that need to be discussed at not only Catholic heritage, individual personality, but also national personality. That's where it gets nuanced and interesting. In terms of my individual experience, it's going to be slightly different to David's, although we do have a lot in common, because our immediate family David will recall this, being older, somewhat better than I will, played a large role in really the establishing tradition in those early days. Back the fallout from Vatican II, our grandfather was a bit of a heavy hitter in that role, in that time. But myself, family, I think that would be the word that I would use to describe my upbringing and my Catholicism. And that's something that is quite interesting in terms of national stereotypes. You look at Europeans, you look at Americans, you look at Australians, and there are things that you think of Italians or maybe even David Argentinians, and big, loud, warm, passionate. A lot they're quite similar from my experience with American heritage. Australia, nationally more kind of reserved, but there is across the board a passion for family. And over time, things that I've sort of been thinking about are how much of these things are actually national traits and how much of them are actually common Catholic traits that have been sort of latched onto in different ways. But that would be very, very warm family upbringing. My father was extremely passionate about Catholicism, as was my mother. Traditional Catholic family on both sides, which I understand to be quite unique, not only to be, zealously Catholic on both sides, but traditionally so. Growing up, I definitely didn't appreciate that the way I do now. And when I say, the way I do now, of course, there's still a long road to hoe ahead. But I had very little appreciation for it. I knew that's what we were. That was part of my identity. But I was probably like every other kid. It got tiring at times. You said your prayers, you went to mass. It probably wasn't until started playing on a few sporting teams where I saw met my first person who wasn't exactly like me. And then thereafter, you're exposed to an increasing number of people like that, where your eyes are just opened and you go, wow, I live a very peculiar kind of lifestyle. And the more people you meet, the more exposure you had. You go to school, you go to university. Retrospectively, you look back and it's a completely different perspective you have at 27 than you do when you're, maybe 13, 14, and, teenaged attitude. But very staunchly Catholic family. That would be my personal experience, and I'm very grateful for that. This might be an opportunity to sort of throw it to David, because it's very difficult to talk about our Australian family Catholic heritage without talking about, I think our fathers and our grandfather, because that to me is such a pivotal element in who we are, but also it ties in kind of neatly with, I think, the story of traditional Catholicism within Australia, because that was a wild ride, and there was some very, very interesting stories.
Oh, please, and by all means.
Yeah.
I'll follow on from Tom there. It's a very good point, and I think a very necessary point to mention, that people like Tom and I who have grown up as traditional Catholics, we've never known anything different. We didn't merit that. We were fortunate to be born into traditional Catholic families from the very beginning. But looking back and thinking about that upbringing, I look back and I go, well, I didn't appreciate it really for what it was either, because it was all handed to me. It's not an intellectual decision that I'd had to make. It was given to me, and you live that way. And I was very fortunate to have, yes, a very staunch immediate family, but extended family as well. And that was a really big support for all of us, and helped keep everyone sort of on the right track. But when you're growing up in that environment, and you've never experienced the other side, it's just what you do, and it's very easy, I think, to sort of get complacent, and just it's almost just part of the furniture. This is what you do, and it's been interesting to reflect on that. And I think for us who've grown up like that, it's very important to make a concerted effort to look back at the history and understand why it was that my parents were traditional Catholics, you know, back when they were married in the mid 1980s. Why is that? And go back and over time, our grandfather died in 1990 at the age of 64. So he passed away fairly young. So I don't have too many memories of my grandfather, but I have spoken to my grandfather and my father and uncles in you know, since I got to adolescence, and you start to realize why is it that you do what you do, and at some level you need an intellectual, at some point you need to come to an intellectual certitude, rather than you doing it just because that's how you've grown up and that's what you've been surrounded with. So I suppose I can give a brief background of, you know, the situation in Australia back in, you know, the mid 1970s. You know, all of these discussions come back to the Second Vatican Council and the introduction of the new Mass. And the reality is that's sort of just the demarcation. And my grandfather at the time, my dad still says that he doesn't know why. And my grandfather couldn't put specifically a finger on it, but he just felt uncomfortable with what was happening. And especially the introduction of the new Mass, that really just, whether it was just this sensus fidei that didn't quite gel with what was going on, but he sort of went off on a limb, you know, not necessarily with the support of his siblings, but he didn't really want to go along. And so he started seeing and hearing some things in the early to mid 1970s that he just really felt uncomfortable with. And it got to a point where he had a parish priest deny the real presence. And there was another occasion where he and, you know, my father and uncles were denied communion when they were kneeling down. The priest said, no, you have to be standing up and you have to be receiving in the hand.
Sound familiar?
Yeah, exactly. So it was those sort of moments that really clarified for our grandfather that something wasn't right, and he didn't want to go along with, I suppose, the orientation or the spirit of the Second Vatican Council. And, you know, disclaimer, Tom and I both grew up in the Society of St. Pius X, which, you know, somewhat controversial topic. I think it's in a sense becoming less so now, but you know, it was a controversial thing back then. And our grandfather, so Archbishop Lefebvre actually came out and visited Australia in I think it was the late 1970s, just for a visit. Did a bit of a tour of Australia. This is before there was any presence of the society in Australia. And our grandfather went and saw some conferences that he gave and spoke to him a bit. And I think Archbishop Lefebvre returned to Australia in the early 1980s, and our grandfather spoke to him and said, you know, we're in a situation where there's maybe two elderly priests who have almost been cast out. One a diocesan priest, one, I can't remember the order that he was in, but effectively been removed because they wanted to continue to say the Latin Mass. Wow. And they were about the only option at the time. And our grandfather went and wrote to the Archbishop and said, can you send priests to Australia? Because we just barely have any option of a Latin Mass, which sort of indicates the extent that there was the suppression of the traditional Latin Mass. And the Archbishop wrote back and said, yes, if you can effectively establish a parish that will have enough parishioners to be able to maintain a parish, I will send you a priest. And so I think it was around the mid 1980s, just from forming alliances and being in contact with other like-minded people who wanted, a real Catholicism. They wanted priests preaching about the four last ends, or the four last things, and teaching correct sexual morality and various things like that. So formed that and wrote to the Archbishop and said, well, we have this now. And so now you need to hold up your end of the bargain. And the Archbishop wrote back and said that he didn't have any priests available, that, he was stretched thin, obviously. But my grandfather, he was a very obdurate and persistent man. And he wrote back and basically said, well, you promised, so I'm holding you to your promise. And so he did end up sending a priest, I think Father Jared Hogan, who's actually stationed, he's somewhere in the United States now, came to Australia in I think it was around 1983, 1984. And that was sort of where it began.
That's so fascinating. So even in Australia, there was, we were just speaking about this before we started recording, but we also, we as American Catholics have this sort of this perspective. This is what Jordan was saying, that we have this sort of perspective of the fight that we're fighting here, and it has its own particular sort of nature to it, right? The sorts of problems that we have in America versus all over the world. But we seldom ever hear the stories of the changes or how they were implemented in other countries. So it's fascinating to be able to talk to you guys about this. To the best of your knowledge, how were the liturgical changes accepted by the people? It seems as if it was universal everywhere. There's a massive suppression. There was no Latin Mass, maybe day to night kind of difference. What you're telling me in that story, you're saying that it was just completely suppressed, like to the point where there wasn't any priest besides those two priests that were offering the Latin Mass.
Well, we were talking about this off air, but once again, it's so good to have David here, because these are things that David he knows, and then I throw in 2 cents worth in terms of observations. But back then, my recollection of the stories I've heard was families driving ridiculously long distances to have Mass in rooms where the location wasn't disclosed. Like you almost hear stories of people doing things out of, in secrecy, out of fear of suppression. And I'm not sure whether those are just stories that I've romanticized in my mind to create that feel. I'll let David comment on that. But you really get the impression that it was a very big deal. And that was something, sort of that this issue was the genesis of the podcast that David and I work on. It was me getting to an age where I thought, you take this seriously, and so it's probably worth scratching away at the surface and talking to those that came before you who either lived through that time or inherited the side effects of that whole period. and you want to learn, you want to see what effect that has had on you. And so through talking to people and talking to David and reading some of those stories, it really opened my eyes to how much of a huge event the changes were. Like, I grew up hearing my grandmother talk about the changes. And as a kid, you roll your eyes, you go, seriously, like, old timer. I'm sure that was important to you, but and then
the Vatican said this is fine, Grandma.
Yeah, but I mean, as a kid, those things just, you're worried about other things. A little bit of maturity, maybe life kicks you a little bit, and you go, I need to become more interested in this. And you acquaint yourself with the stories, and you go, wow, that was socially, politically, religiously, my impression is it was a really tumultuous time, especially in Australia, because we wouldn't have had the resources. We don't have that national character of, the American fighting personality. There was a massive fight out here, but it was on a lot smaller. I get the impression there were far fewer devotees of tradition in Australia than possibly there were in America. David?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, you look at Australia has currently a population of about 27 million. Back then it would have been maybe less than 20 million. So yes, a large geographical location, but in terms of people, much smaller than the United States. But yeah, from speaking to people and family, I think the overwhelming majority of Catholics, and lots of good, well-meaning Catholics, and we have a lot of our great aunts and uncles who still practicing Catholics, in the more mainstream way. But yeah, the overwhelming majority of people just accepted it and went along with it. And I can, once again, my grandfather was dad admits he could be a pain in the ass. But he would go and visit the bishops, in whatever location he would, and he would sit down and talk with them, and he would say that a lot of them weren't really enthusiastic about the changes, but they just went along with it. And I think most of the faithful were in the same boat.
And that's a point that actually really, really interests me, because people who are put on a spot to make a choice about something, there's a difficult choice that has to be made. And even, the investigations David and I have been doing, and the conversations we have with you and a lot of other people, we're not actually, we're making a choice to maintain something that we've been given. I think a lot of other people, for one reason or another, have recently maybe been placed in a position where they've got to make choices one way or another in other areas of life. We're all put in positions where we have to make choices, but the ability and maybe the virtue required to make a really difficult choice in life is something that recently I think I've come to really appreciate. And that's not saying that I have the virtue to make a good choice, because I possibly don't. All it's saying is enormous respect and admiration for those who made difficult choices. And there's also maybe a bit of I don't want to say empathy, but maybe that's the word, for people who couldn't bring themselves to do things. Like, I've intellectually come to entirely accept the position and the traditional Catholicism that I was gifted as a child. But that doesn't mean that when people, maybe it's just out of they can't bring themselves to make a decision. I don't feel like I think cruelly of them. I think there is so much confusion, so much difficulty, that maybe it just leads to an increased gratitude for what it is we do have. Because, but for the grace of God go I. Maybe that's the point. I think that's something that I've really come to understand recently, because I'm a rat bag. And if I was born any other way, God help us all.
Yeah, that's something that Rudy and I talk about a lot on the channel here. Is we have two phrases. One is a tale of two churches, and the other one is a great divorce. And not quite in the C.S. Lewis way on that last one, but how we're all children of a fallout that's, in our laity opinion, it's a war the church not how to wage. You know, once upon a time, your guys' grandfather, us actually, all of us had this decision, but everyone woke up and went, I feel like the faith that I've understood for the entirety of my life is being changed. And people are insisting that I'm the one going crazy for feeling it. It's somehow okay now that a priest is denying the real presence. And if I am to say something about that, that's a problem. For us over here, a lot of it is, especially in the case of with the quarantine, and Rudy and I had a little micro series on essentially life in lockdown, where we would have it was the first time we started our video podcast and we weren't next to each other. But we were really genuinely scandalized in the actual usage of the word by the fact that for decades at this point, as Catholics, we would go to Mass and we would hear the stories of all these brave martyrs and saints and Christ himself who would go out to heal lepers and be not afraid and all this other kind of stuff. And then it seemed like a lot of the churches gleefully shut themselves off in a world where liquor stores and Costco was open. This is one sin with the Archdiocese in Los Angeles. And I say the story because it's a very true thing, but our priests at St. Vitus were building socially distanced confessions preemptively. And that wasn't even enough for the Archdiocese. The Archdiocese told them to shut it down. And so there was a stretch where you couldn't go to Mass, you couldn't receive confession. Rudy has a whole thing with his father in last rites. And at a so-called Catholic hospital, how it's very clear that the salvation of souls is not the priority for some people. And, in my family, I come from a family where I'm the only one of my siblings, and I'm really the only one, even in my extended family, maybe a couple blurbs in the ether that's understood and gone traditional Catholic. Love the upbringing that I had, growing up in the Novus Ordo environment that I did. I'm grateful for it because it taught me the love of Jesus. But one thing that I think is so interesting about your guys' story, especially with your grandfather and the conversation between Lefebvre and him, is that you're not talking about a priest in one of the states in California or in Australia, sorry, but you're talking about sending one priest for the entirety of the country. And that's something that's so crazy for us to think about in this fight and the suppression of the old Mass. It's that suddenly all these people it was ripped away. And I'm always interested in people that went along with the changes. And I think it's because, again, most Catholics need a point in their life where it's almost like the Protestant conversion moment, right? I think that there's a point where you both talked about this intellectual ascent, which I think is absolutely beautiful. I completely agree with that. There's this moment where you have to go, this is not just that Jesus loves me and that God exists, but this is his church and this is the manner of worship which ought to be followed. I love the woman at the wells, when she says, our ancestors worship on this mountain. It implies that they worship in a particular way here. And that's all literally that traditional Catholics want to do. And maybe you can speak to this a little bit, but where we both in our different places in the States, our churches are renovated and renovated, some of them. Some people really fought hard for their architecture. I'm just curious, just on the cultural level, but when we think about the Catholic Church in Australia, what pragmatically on the ground do those churches actually look like? Because obviously, with the history of Australia, it's not just it doesn't seem like a Catholic, obviously like a foremost country. So are these churches, were they beautiful and were they renovated? Are we talking about kind of more like simple scrub churches in the ether that were changed completely, or what's the kind of balance there? I'll start with you, Tom.
Well, let's talk wider Catholic. Let's go back to the First Fleet and thereafter when the first Catholic clergy would have come out and the first church would have been established. There are some gorgeous churches, some beautiful historical churches in Australia. Make no mistake, maybe there is this national stereotype that Australia is sort of an outback settlement, and it's come a little bit of a long way since then, believe it or not. You've got Adelaide, which some people refer to as the city of churches, just this beautiful, quaint capital of South Australia. Melbourne, it's going through a heck of a lot at the moment, and I'd say it's the direction and ideology that's governing Melbourne at the moment is as far from Catholic as you can get. But that being said, Melbourne has an extremely rich historical Catholic history. There are other influences in that, but you drive through Melbourne and you see these beautiful sandstone or bluestone churches that are, to me, beautiful. Sydney, Brisbane, there's a couple of stunning churches there. Tradition, slightly different. There are a few churches that we've scored from in terms of we've either inherited them or we've been able to make a good deal with a reluctantly willing seller. But I think to understand tradition in Australia, you almost have to take a missionary perspective. And I think that would explain, we use what we can get. So, for example, the main parish church in Brisbane, I believe, it was converted from a Protestant hall. And some people come in and go, gosh, this is the ugliest church I've ever seen.
David gets a kick out of that one.
It's not far from the truth.
Architecturally, it's possibly true. But that being said, what it stands for and what it's done over time, it's got a beautiful story, and it is a beautiful church because it's been there for so long and it's given the faithful that have come to it so much. So I think in understanding the society's position, you sort of have to understand that missionary kind of history, and I think it's still living through that wider traditional Catholic circles. For example, you've got some indults, you've got oratory. Sorry, that's what I'm thinking of. Maybe due to some beneficial relationships with the diocese, they've been a little more fortunate in terms of the architecture they've been given. Look, it is what it is, and you have to follow the story closely, I think, to understand those things. And interestingly enough, though, talking about you cast your mind back to those stories of the early days when there was literally one Catholic or one traditional priest dispatched from wherever to, administer to all the faithful in Australia. And I think if you look back historically, even retrospectively, you could almost say, but for that precarious position then, the entire traditional Catholic landscape worldwide would have been entirely different. So I think whether you're Oratorian, whether you're indult, I think we are, maybe strong statement of the day. I think we're all standing, David will agree with me on this. We're all standing on the shoulders of the tough decisions of Archbishop Lefebvre, I think, back in those tough times.
It's interesting too, that a lot of the conversations that we're having nowadays in traditional Catholic circles, like with Traditionis Custodes, it's really opening up those questions that we thought were sort of settled, are we just going to go along with it? Are people going to stand and fight this? Will tradition prevail again? And I think people have gotten into the position where they have to ask those questions that Archbishop Lefebvre had to, answer in his time. Are we going to continue to stand and hold fast to the traditions that we've been given, or are we just going to go along with this new rite that we've seen be in many cases a detriment to people's faith. Not always, obviously, but
But that's, if I can comment on that quickly, that's
Sure.
such an interesting point to me, because you can, it's so easy with so many of these discussions to get caught up in the minutiae and make them very academic, and a lot of them are academic. But there have been some beautiful, that's a good word, beautiful people in my life who have sort of approached it with a simplicity and phrases as straightforward as, oh, yeah, just look at the fruits, look at what happened. And once again, that can be something as a young kid you sort of roll your eyes at. But growing older and getting that increased level of exposure to what goes on around. And when I say, around and out there in the world, I can even tend at times to feel somewhat conflicted, because a lot of my closest friends are not the same way. They are, lapsed Catholic, fallen away Catholic, not Catholic at all, atheistic. But if there was something which really convinced me that, if you're going to be Catholic, you're going to be traditional Catholic, was the increased level of exposure I got to those friends of mine or peers, even colleagues, who were the product of, as my grandmother would say, the changes. And it's so stark and it's so true. The vast majority of them have given their faith away. And you almost think, well, why wouldn't they? It was so trite, and so, even if it was administered with the best of intentions, it was kind of pathetic. And that's what they saw. This would be interesting to get. I know you, Rudy and Jordan, have different backgrounds, and you had to make all these choices, and it's completely different for David and me. And it's easy for me to say this because I knew nothing else. So I was coming from a very staunchly traditional foundation, and then observing and contrasting. And so the only choice I had to make was sort of compare and contrast that with how I thought, and then draw a conclusion. And to me, that was very obvious. Somebody calls themselves Catholic, or they start distancing themselves from their Catholicism. Catholicism is lame. I don't go to church, or la-di-da. But it was just insanely obvious to me that if you were going to bother with the Catholic thing, there was only one way to do it, because there was only one way that took it seriously.
Well, speak on this a little bit, David, because you not just being also a traditional Catholic here, but also being a father, and having a little Massey clan, clearly. For us, it's funny that both of you even mentioned like having great aunts and great uncles in the new right more, and so I wonder, just in terms of that family kind of perspective, people don't realize this, but the kind of war that we're waging it's not just an intellectual or historical sort of argument we're making. I think that the greatest agent for the sort of reclamation of the faith comes from what the Catholics have been doing for centuries, which is that at one point you literally just have to make enough babies to pass down the faith. What we've been inherited, we are a missionary sorts of people, but also we build up the home church. And so with your 7 children especially, do you kind of see that entrenchment for the next generation? What does that landscape look like positively? Because Rudy has a child, God willing, we'll have children, so you can kind of see what the battle's really about in those instances.
Yes, certainly. I'll be honest, it's a frightening time to be a parent right now. And there are moments where I go, what is life going to look like for my children in 20, 30, 40, 50 years? And then I look back at my own upbringing, and the degradation of society that's happened, let's say, over the last decade has been exponential almost. And we can talk about things were bad back in the day. There were these changes that were happening that were starting to erode a real solid Catholic foundation. But there was generally still some upholding of morality and value of the family environment and structure. And I have seen that be attacked so much over the last decade. However, having said that, you know, it's the only answer. I think you're right, Jordan. And there's so much happiness and joy that you get from participating and doing that role in terms of any restoration. And it's quite simple in the end. If that's your calling in life, that's the state that God has called you to, then the most important thing is to try and be the best husband and father that you can. And I think in this day and age, having a real generosity and trust in God's providence is extremely important, because we all know that God gives back 100-fold in generosity. And look, it's not easy being a father of 6 children with one on the way. They're all young. I mean, even without being Catholic or trying to pass on the faith to your children, just living with a large family in this day and age is more difficult than it ever has been. Mm-hmm. Especially with my wife, who is a stay-at-home mother. You know, so we have a single income, and it's not as difficult to get by with a single income as a lot of people will try and tell you. Mm-hmm. It sometimes means a little bit of sacrifice, and you go without some things, and you know, we're comfortable, but it's not an easy thing. But when you see these children, and my children go to a Society of St. Pius X school, which very fortunate to have nearby, and you see that the formation that they receive for first confession and first communion. And I have my son Raphael, who's just made his first confession and will be making his first communion next month. And you look at the thorough formation and teaching that they get in that environment, and they're fortunate to have other family and friendships, good influences on them, and that gives you a lot of hope for the future. And you've got to have that hope. Catholicism should be joyful. It should be joyful whether you're being left alone to practice and propagate the faith. It should be joyful whether you're being persecuted, because ultimately, you know, we all know what the most important things are. So yeah, that generosity with, I suppose, accepting the children that God sends you, mm-hmm. That's a huge thing, I think, because it's not always easy to I suppose give up your own will and somewhat of your comfort, and just go, well, if you send us children, we'll do our best with them, you know.
And maybe I'm the only one here who's actually qualified to speak on this point, because I'm the only one who has successfully clung to the single lifestyle thus far.
Hey. Well, after this podcast, you better watch out, you know.
Yeah,
not at all. But ultimate respect for parents, and as somebody who had parents. I believe I had parents. I had 2 of them and I knew them. Recently lost one. But a such a beautiful family, and two parents who I don't think could have done more for me in terms of giving me the best chance and giving themselves the best chance to be able to, at the end. When my dad passed away, I don't think he could have done more for me in terms of giving me the gift that he was given, which I think is the goal of every parent, to pass on what you've been given, and fingers crossed, maybe leave the world and your children in a better position than you were in. That being said, there's then the individual factor. There's the me part, and that's what frightens me in terms of when you have kids and you look at the state of the world, and being born traditionally Catholic and having been gifted it on a silver platter. I think there is an enormous reality and a danger. I don't want to call it, maybe it's a danger. It's a great thing, but it's, from my perspective, maybe it's just my personality. Not having had to fight for something means there's an emotional element that you will never have. You can intellectually justify something. You can have those moments of joy and gratitude that you're on this side of the fence. But at the end of the day, if you didn't have to go through some emotional, tumultuous struggle and make a choice to have something, that's a big thing. And to me, if I feel that, one of the, I guess, the intended target audiences for the bread and butter lounge room chat I do with young people, like when I sat down with David, however many millions of years ago it was, and heard David's awesome story. It's what it's trying to do, I guess, is hit at issues in terms of why would a young person like you make the decision to be a Catholic, be traditionally Catholic, make the sacrifices involved with being a parent and having children and going for that traditional family model. Because in this day and age, it doesn't make sense. You are actually looked on as peculiar and strange, and society works against you. And if you're not caught up in that struggle in terms of the immediacy of it, God help. And so I think that the struggle is trying to cultivate that appreciation in some way for your children. And the only reason I say that is I think that's sort of what my parents, in one way or another, tried to do with us. And I'm not sure how effective they were in it, but I think that's what everybody's got to do with, something they're trying to pass on. You've got to pass on an appreciation for something that the kid may just not understand. But you've given the importance of it. It's that first Christmas present the kid gets that isn't a toy. It's actually infinitely more important than the toy, but it's not a toy. So the kid frowns and they're like, don't worry, kid, trust me on this. This is worth it.
Yeah.
And you're just trusting that one day the kid's going to go, you know what? Yeah, my dad was right. Something like that. It's a scary time, but joyous.
Yes.
That's something that I wanted to kind of dig deeper on. David, I'm a new father myself. You obviously have had more experience with that than I have. But one of the fears, and Jordan and I talk about this often too, is we want our kids to just kind of inherit the faith and make it so that it's nothing controversial, because for us, I think we experience a sort of controversial aspect of the faith. We want to be Catholic, we want to hold fast to tradition, but it's so often like really hard to do that. Not just interiorly, but exteriorly. We can't find the mass, people can't go anywhere, or the mass becomes suppressed, or that sort of thing. But we talk about how we want to just have this sort of normal experience for our children. But in talking to both of you, it sort of seems that that there was a moment in your interior life where you had to sort of realize what you had and make, as you said, like a choice to continue it, and to not just to continue it, but also to do it ardently, to do it authentically. Could you both speak to what that moment was for you? That moment that really changed your perspective, where you realized, okay, I have a pearl of great price here. I'm going to have to make sure that I live a certain way to keep it or to maintain this.
Yeah. For me, and I have seen your episode about Ignatian retreats with Father Burford, which I really enjoyed. For me, I went on an Ignatian retreat when I finished high school. My parents, you can't help being influenced by the world as a teenager. You can't. And I think some parents I have seen can make the mistake where they try and shelter their children from any outside influence, which I think is absolutely counterproductive, because you have to live in the world. You don't want to be of the world, but you have to be in the world. And I think it's very important that you don't try and close off your children too much. You do want to sort of put some barriers and try and ensure that your children have good friendships, etc. But you can't just shut people off. And that's an important perspective for parents. And I look at myself when I was 17, almost 18. I finished high school, and I took, largely I practiced, I believe. So I never had a moment where I thought God doesn't exist, or does God really exist, or is this all a facade? I never struggled in terms of faith, but you start picking up some of those worldly influences. And I had definitely picked them up myself, despite a very solid upbringing that my parents had given me. And I think they could probably see it. And so they really encouraged me to go on a retreat when I finished high school. So I did an Ignatian retreat. Looking back, I think I was probably too young at almost 18 years of age. I won't say it was detrimental, but I certainly didn't get out of it what you probably should from an Ignatian retreat. And it wasn't until probably 3 or 4 years later, we had a new priest come to our parish who was very devoted to the Ignatian retreats and really made that his mission. He ended up putting on, 3 or 4 retreats for men and women each year, and really pushed the parishioners to go and do it. And even beyond that, he had some involvement in our youth group, where rather than, my experience with youth groups had been, I suppose, a little bit vanilla. It was, well, we're all like-minded. We come and we have that social aspect. But there was what I think I needed, and what this priest sort of introduced to the youth group that we had, was a more intellectual aspect, where he would say, here's a book. Often, I think the first one was They Have Uncrowned Him by Archbishop Lefevbre. And, as a 21, 22-year-old, I wasn't, going to Dad saying, I need your copy of this book. I really want to read it. But, he would say, for example, everyone go and read the first chapter of this book, and we'll come and discuss it, and I'll take you through it, and what are your perspectives on this? And it forced you to do a little bit more in the background. And then, yes, afterwards you would have the social aspect, eat pizza, have a good time with other like-minded young Catholics. But it was that sort of prompt to look into these things a little bit more intellectually. And it was not long after that that I did my second Ignatian retreat. And that for me was where the penny dropped. And I actually did a really good, I was a little bit more mature. But you know, having 6 days away from the world, complete silence, and having a bit more openness to it myself, and that was the sort of moment for me where I thought, you know, after that retreat, after that general confession, which is just the most enormous relief I think you could almost have in life. Was I walked away from that retreat, still had all my faults and particular fault and all these issues I need to work on and still need to work on. But that's when it sort of dropped for me that, no, I do believe this. I mean, I never doubted it, but I had a real firm belief that this is real. This is what God wants. And if I believe that, I now need to actively conform my life to that. So for me, that was sort of the moment, that moment, and it's that moment that everyone has to come to, and especially those of us who have been given it. You need to really consent to it, and make a very conscious decision that this is what I want, and I'm now going to live it.
It's amazing. Yeah, the Ignatian spiritual exercises are really a powerful weapon for you to apply into your life. This reality that, you know, this is God, this is what he did for me, this is what the church teaches, and this is who I am. I'm a sinner. I have all of these different things that are preventing me from really experiencing the grace of God. And those exercises really give you an opportunity to make a game plan. And
yeah,
I think everybody that I've met who's done the exercises in some way, shape, or form, I've never actually done them formally the way that they were supposed to do. I've done like a truncated version, where you know, you kind of show up one day out of the week, but you're still living in the world. You know, it's not like a retreat house. But everybody that I've talked to that's been through that particular Ignatian exercise, or even the actual ones, their life completely changes. I totally recommend for people to really make that effort to take that Ignatian spiritual exercise retreat. And let's be honest, I mean, 6 days away from your work, 6 days away from your wife, from your kids and stuff, that's really, you know, it seems ardent, you know, it seems like a really arduous thing. I mean, but it's such a huge investment into your spiritual life. You know, think of how much that's going to pay out, or how much of an investment that is that could pay out for your family returning home, you know, with that sense of clarity.
I will just say, in terms of Ignatian retreats, I think it's very important not to push anyone to it. I think that there can be encouragement, and, you know, some gentle prodding, but I've also seen the other side of it, and, you know, I have a sibling who no longer practices the faith, and, you know, I think my parents had some inkling that there were some issues at the time, and they I won't say forced, and certainly that they encouraged her to do a retreat. But if your heart isn't in it, then you won't get anything out of it. And I feel like my sibling in that situation didn't. So I think it takes a great humility, because I'll be honest, I think I've done 3 or 4 in total, and each time there's part of me that goes, I don't want to do this. You know, it's not an easy thing to do, and it takes a great deal of humility to go, wow, I need to revisit in detail all this sinfulness of the past 3, 4, 5 years, you know, and who wants to do that?
Right.
It's not an easy thing. So I think you need to also come to it. It takes humility and just go, all right, yes, the thought of it, the concept might be painful, but I just have to humble myself and go, and I know God will reward you. So I absolutely recommend it to anyone who has the means. Yeah.
Yeah. And for Tom, for you, I know that in your story that you told us when we were on with you, you had this thing where you would learn the ontological arguments for the existence of God, was trying it out on a friend who didn't believe, and if I remember correctly, he asked you just like, well, what does that mean? What does ontological mean? And it was like, how's the cards, right? You know, moving down. And so I think that's such a beautiful thing to talk about, especially off of David's story there. And we'll pray for your sister, and for everyone, because, you know, I have, you know, for all of our siblings, you know, we all have people that have gone away from the faith. And one thing that always breaks my heart is that you get these calls into different Catholic shows, and it's like, oh, my child, my brother, my son, my whatever has left the faith. How do I get it back? And I think, you know, for all of us on the path that we're on, you know, there is an acceptance of God's love and his grace that you have to agree to. You could have the intellectual argument, you can have the steps of spiritual renewal, yeah. But if the heart hasn't given over to Christ, then, you know, then you're not going to get anything. It is literally just smells and bells. Wouldn't you say, Tom?
Wow. Yeah. This is such a I always say, oh, that's so interesting. This is particularly interesting.
That should be your next show, you know? Oh, that's so
it's very, this is interesting. We'll go with that. This is something that's particularly close to my heart, I think, because we're talking about, you know, road to Damascus moments. I never had one. I've never had one. I don't think my parents could have given me a better Catholic upbringing than they did. Maybe I'm looking at that through, you know, biased rose-colored glasses, but that's how I see. And you combine that with my personality. I'm very loyal to whatever flag it is, I guess, that's hoisted to the family mast. Maybe that's part and parcel of my American citizenship. You know, I was a devoted student of the red and white, my school colors, very passionate American. I'm very passionate about my faith. But something that hit me at some point when I was growing up, it was, you know, page 1 of the Imitation of Christ. And I can't remember what the phrase or the sentence is, but sort of paraphrasing it. It's, you know, what good is it to be able to define charity if you don't have charity? You know, you can understand the Trinity, you can know all the secrets of the world, but if you don't love and you don't follow the commandments, you know, what is the point? And that's always been the interesting thing that I've struggled to understand about both myself and people. And the reason I love having these conversations is they're kind of therapeutic for me. They're counseling sessions. I get to talk to people who I admire, but I see myself as asking questions on behalf of a category of people who struggle and who have struggled. And how do you solve that conflict between having an intellectual acceptance and even a love of something, but you struggle to be true to it? And I don't know if you can intellectually understand it, but the struggle is real because there are so many people who struggle with the faith. There are so many people who end up leaving it because of a continued struggle. I've definitely struggled over the years. And it's something that I don't particularly like talking about, but anybody who knows me will know that I've definitely made a lot of mistakes and I've struggled with things. And they're the moments, it's sort of ironic, I think, when I've maybe taken that step forward, because it's only when you feel like you've lost something that you appreciate it. It's sort of, it doesn't make more sense. The intellectual element is there, but to me, there's always been a separation between there's a separation between the intellect and the emotions, but you have to fuse the two at some stage to propel yourself in that direction. And so I'm not really sure where I'm going with this, but I've never had a road to Damascus moment. I've always struggled with certain things, but I've tried to sort of propel myself in a direction that I go. So long as I'm doing that, I'm probably giving myself half a chance, giving myself a better chance if I try and familiarize myself with other people who have gone through the similar struggles, who have believed everything that I believed, but struggled in the same ways that I've struggled. Maybe that gives me and other people like me a better chance at getting that 51% on the big exam that we're all gonna sit one day.
That's right.
But it's extremely difficult, and that's what you do take away, though. And what I have heard from talking to other people, they all say it, Catholicism is beautiful. And to me, I think that's one of the things that pains me more than anything is I appreciate that. And that's one of the things that has always kept me going. It's an appreciation for the beauty inherent in Catholicism. You can kick it, you can do the wrong thing by it, but it's truth. And in that truth is a beauty. In that truth is a solace, a peace that if you just reconcile yourself with it, it will give you everything that it promises to give you. Peace, stability, joy, happiness.
It's not by happenstance that we call our podcast a Glad Trad podcast. I think that there is now we know it's confirmed, there is a worldwide movement of traditional Catholics in actions. My joke is that if social media or if YouTube had existed at the time of the council, can you imagine how much more uppity Catholics would have been? because isolation, your grandfather writing in Lefevbre, us all being here on this place, I mean, the whole world would have changed. And so for us and Rudy, there is a moment for laughter, there's a moment for war, risus et bellum. And we try to do a little bit of both. We started this podcast because genuinely we found a deeper love of Christ through the traditional Latin Mass and through the traditional forms of piety, devotions, and histories. I mean, there was just, and it wasn't just to dunk on Novus Ordites, although that's, it can be kind of fun to do, not gonna lie. Most of them knew Mass and how crazy it could be, but it really is.
Some of them deserve it.
Well, yeah. We just went through a climate, a very hippy dippy climate mass at the LA Rec in 2016. So sometimes you look at that and you're like, you got to call a duck a duck. But it's all motivated, and this is what I love about traditionalists now, especially, is that our grandfathers and our parents, they were really in the trenches in ways that we've had hints of, and sometimes we've gone to the trenches, but like, they had the faith ripped away in such a violent manner. And if they spoke up about it, Michael Matt at the Remnant, your guys' grandfather, they were called rad trads. They were pushed to the farthest corners of the empire. I mean, these people, this is why we say, we're not sorry or need to apologize for if, especially some of our older trad ancestors had a bit of an axe to grind, because they found themselves at war unwittingly and they just had to do it. The cavalry wasn't coming. And for us now, it's nice that there's a sort of war that we're finding ourselves in now, but the stakes are different, but also the battlefield has changed completely. It's not crazy to be called a rad trad. You're just like, whatever. It's not, everyone knows it's easy to see that, the traditionalists inside Catholicism, they're not just a bunch of angry old fuddy-duddies clinging on to their desire to say their rosarios all throughout a mass or something. I mean, it's vibrant because people in our age group, if they're not falling in love with the faith in its authentic form, they're leaving the faith.
And how that, so, and I think the question becomes, how do you fall in love with it? Because my message would be, as I think, our collective message would be, that Catholicism is beautiful and it's worth loving. But so many people who, especially the ones who grow up in it, see it as a series of prescriptions and proscriptions. Do this, don't do that. You can do this, you can't do that. You've got to be here at this time on this day of the week. Otherwise, you're in the state of sin.
You know what it is?
It's regimented. And so is it possible, without engaging in the intellectual rigor, to see beyond that, to see the fullness of it?
Well, there you go. David, what do you think first? Because we're both, all of us, I know.
I think it is extremely important to, as you are titled, the glad element of it is extremely important. I have seen, all types of the stereotypical Latin mass goer over my 35 years. So I've seen them all, and there's an element of truth in all of them. There absolutely are the ones who only focus on the negatives all the time and are obviously not happy. And,
it's a broad church.
It is a broad church. And look, some of them have legitimate reasons to be unhappy, but ultimately, I think there's something missing from your faith if you can only focus on the negatives, because living a Catholic life, it should be joyful. And I think as a father and as someone who was lucky enough to grow up with a wider, an extended family who all had the same values, but we had fun. Our family gatherings were fun gatherings.
They still are.
They are. We just had our cousin's wedding on the weekend. And it was so much fun.
That means, real quick, that means a marriage on Saturday, confession on Sunday. Is that correct?
I need more time to prepare.
Maybe back in the day.
Yes.
Yes. But yeah, it's a joyous occasion, but it's fun. But even beyond those sort of very special moments, I can remember going and visiting my grandmother as a 6 or 7 year old with my other first cousins, and you'd go and play, have a great time, lots of good food. My mum and dad and aunts and uncles would crack open the beer and the wine, and we'd have a good time, and then it'd get towards the evening, and we'd sit down and say the rosary together, and it was that was
Amazing.
Would I have been there for that?
It wasn't this entire focus on Catholicism all the time, but there were always those moments that would go, all right, the focus is on God and our faith, and it was a very striking thing as a child to see that and think back on that as well. So I think that's a really good illustration of how I think things should be. It's not always easy. I mean, as you say, people don't always have those connections, those family units don't always have a wide group of friends. But in whatever group you have, I think it's important to celebrate the major feasts. And if you drink, have some wine. Have a good time. Don't be puritanical, and be joyful. you know.
Mhm.
There's still so many opportunities to have fun as a Catholic and as a traditional Catholic.
And more, it's funny that because America, of course, our history is so deeply innately Puritan, and anyone that did a little bit of digging past their high school textbook knows that the reason they're Puritans is because they found the Church of England to be too Catholic. So I've always said that that we've inherited some of that just across the culture. Clearly, it can be, especially sometimes in traditional Catholicism, but for the American society, I think it's a pendulum. It's moving towards Puritan regulation of morality, and it's moving anti that. And inside traditional Catholicism, I see that too, is kind of the great frontier. It's that part of our joyous thing is also just to fight against the fact that it's not just rhythm and regimentation. The faith is first and foremost a love story. It's a story about how God so loved the world, he incarnate in the flesh. And I think that the heart of especially why we do the things that we do, why all of us here push for a Holy Week that doubles its time, why all of us would be happily sit 2 hours in mass with 6, 7 screaming kids, whatever it is, it's because of the love story. If the analogy I think about it is that when I saw Genevieve, I knew that she was beautiful, and I would later find out that she was good and holy. But also, I didn't dictate what sort of perfume she wore. I responded to it because it was beautiful and good, but I didn't dictate that. I didn't have a bear set. It's a will of the heart, and so this is what I think is a way of the faith, and why the smells and bells and the things our ancestors did matter. I didn't dictate why it's plain chant, or why it's polyphony, or why the incense is a particular way, or why Christmas or midnight mass or whatever lasts 3, 4, 5 hours. But it's a love story. And so, it's if you realize that the amount of grace and love that God pours out on us, we can't even fathom, we can't even calculate. Our concept of time, our concept of boredom, our concept of tradition, everything, it all melds away, because it's not even worth one iota for just how intimately deep God loves you and wants to be with you. And, if that's the heart of the faith, that it's no wonder that as we see this pendulum in the church swinging back, that it's not just trads who want to make a statement against a lot of the craziness they've seen, but more and more those also are just so speaking in the positive too, or realizing that there's this great tradition, and now they get to be a part of that too.
Beautiful.
Oh, thank you. My Academy Award, hopefully. As we wind down, there's one question I have, and I'm sure Rudy has one more too, but I just have this one, and I'll have you both, because I've been dying to ask it. It's a bit of a change of gears, but it's related. So Rudy and I, we are buddies, and one person who's been on our podcast quite a bit is the esteemed Charles Colomb, who is a wonderful commentator, author, and also the first monarchist that I'd ever met in my life. So we had a whole episode where we talked about what monarchism is. With the traditional Thomists, we talked about integralism. So we've been we've been really flirting with this thing. But we've never actually lived in a monarchy, because we were the ones that said, forget that, I'm going home. So Australia is still part of the Commonwealth, right?
Yes.
Okay, good. So tell us across the way, so when we talk about monarchism, it's a sort of a hypothetical notion. And there's a book Charles Colomb wrote called Star Spangled Crown, which is that if a monarchy came to the United States, what might that actually look like? And if it was a Catholic one, what might it look like? Considering that you are both technically subjects of the Queen, what does that actually feel like, actually?
I'll just let you know, today is actually the Queen's birthday public holiday.
She's going to live forever.
In Australia. Yeah. So it's not actually the Queen's birthday. I don't actually know when her real birthday is, but yes, we get the Queen's birthday national holiday every year, and today's the day.
I was under the impression that y'all just celebrated the King or Queen's birthday on July the 4th, just to kind of
rub it in.
That's my wife's birthday.
Hey, happy birthday.
So yes.
Good day for freedom.
Yeah.
No, look, it's actually a really interesting question because that the legal technicalities aside, which you'd probably need to delve into to really understand the current landscape in that regard, it's token at best. Gone are the days where the monarch has the power required for the monarchy to mean anything. There's been a lot of acts passed which have since, shifted where the power is held. And so I think, there's probably one coming up in the not too distant future. You have the Republicans who get together, anti-monarchists who want to we'll have a referendum, and the question will be, do we lose the monarchy and go with I guess what you'd call a republic? And that is yet to get through, which is absolutely fascinating. It's nothing to my mind but a sentimental attachment. I love the tradition, even though the crown is Church of England. I still love the idea of not kicking out your past, your identity purely for the sake of it. Holding on to what is good in the past and sifting through the dross and identifying and clinging to things that are worth holding on to. But in reality, David, would you agree that there is very little real influence or impact that the monarchy has on our day-to-day lives?
Yes. Yeah. It's very symbolic.
The Governor General.
Now.
That's about
as I think it still has some. I think it's still emotionally and even intellectually to a point has some influence on people. And yes, I'm with Tom. I like the concept of it that there is still a monarchy, even if it is largely symbolic these days. It's interesting, but it does go back also to the very Protestant roots of Australia as well. And that's something we didn't really touch on earlier, but yeah, the Catholics coming to Australia, very missionary, because we were a very Protestant country, very much under the direction of England and their monarchy. But yeah, we have lots of, we've got the statue of Queen Victoria up in one of the main squares in the city of Brisbane here. There's a statue of King George. There's lots of symbols of that heritage, which is interesting. I like that. But I think maybe not inevitable, but it wouldn't surprise me if over the next decade or two, Australia votes to become a republic.
I don't get that. I simply don't understand that, why people would want to start a republic. Just look at what's going on here in the United States. It almost doesn't, it's like meaningless,
Well, we're having
representation here.
Republic, for you guys, it would be that there's the president and the prime minister, right? Though that the executive is kind of split in the two ways, where here in the United States it's one, which is why we've kind of we've in the United States technically just had soft kings every 4-8 years. If you see our drift of power, but they're not very good ones, and they don't even look cool. So
I have a question about Australia. I've never actually sat down with two people who actually live there. But here in the United States, we're going through a sort of a revision of our history. We're taking down monuments. We're taking down anything that has any semblance of the past, whether it's something that we agreed with or not. Or there's a really modern way of looking at the past with just a modern perspective. It sort of diminishes what the past is. We compartmentalize it into something else because we have this sort of perspective for it. Is there anything like that going on in Australia? And the reason I ask this is because you mentioned that there's statues of the Queen in a certain part of town. Do you ever imagine that they would take something like that down, or is there a lot of people there who are just wanting to get away from their heritage?
Do you want to answer first, Dave?
Sure. Look, I can't see that happening in the short term. So I sort of watch a little bit of what goes on in the United States and around the world. So I've seen that they've been tearing down statues of General Lee, for example, was it?
Mm-hmm.
Junipero Serra.
Even Honest Abe gets a run every once in a while, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I've seen that happening. Obviously, that's. Do you think that's truly representative of a shift in attitudes in the United States, or do you think that that's being driven by more a minority that's trying to impose that sort of view on the majority? Because we have some similar undercurrents here politically, but it doesn't manifest itself, not so far, like it can in the United States.
That's killer. I think it seems like it's a little bit of both. This ties back to the Second Vatican Council, right? We're sitting here in the aftermath and we're going, how the heck was Lefebvre the only one, essentially a name that was crazy enough to do the only real sane thing? You know, like, how is it that everyone knows his name and there's not the other ones? You know, that's crazy. Is it, you know, wouldn't there have been more people? How is it that my grandfather, who was born in the 1930s, you know, and is a good Catholic man, very devout, way far better Catholic than I am, how is it that there were not little revolts happening in little podunk villages in New Mexico or on the East Coast, or, you know, Fulton J. Sheen didn't lead a riot to the Capitol or something? And I can only, and that's what it seems like. It seems like, you know, in history, what I've been discovering is that there is a minority of zealots on both sides. They're those of the Second Vatican Council, those reformers, those progressives who are really hell bent. They were a small amount. There was a small amount of hardcore traditionalists, the Ottavianis and the Lefebvres, who were like, wait a second, this is a line here, that's ridiculous. And then it seems like there's a term that Rudy used for a particular excellency that I like so much, which is that the majority of people are company men. They are just looking at where the wind blows and are figuring out how to kind of survive in these sorts of moments. I think that's what's happening today. I do think that politically in the United States, there is a minority that is in power, that is allowed to seem like they're in power, would probably be more accurate, that when push comes to shove are completely paper tigers. There are far more people who are trying to survive, but there's a growing minority of zealots who are becoming jaded and tired enough, and they have these conversations across culture and are realizing that they're not the only ones. And so it's interesting because when actually these two sides ever meet, it's pretty decisive one way that the other side's a paper tiger. This is what I also think is probably going to be true in the church, with this approaching synod of the synods, of synodality that ever synoded, you know. And after we've had just round after round of getting hit in the face, I look at something like Traditionis Custodes and I go, okay, well, pragmatically, at least here in the United States, what has it actually accomplished? And the majority of bishops have been like, my fraternities and my Institutes of Christ the Kings aren't really bothering anybody, so I'm not gonna put the hammer down. You know, I don't care less. If the Pope wants to come here and do it personally, let him go here and do it personally. There have been other ones, a very minority of them, who are like, oh, thank God, finally we can crush these buggers, and off they go. So, you know, I think that's kind of the state here too. And maybe it's just kind of, again, we talked about this, the difference of the national, what was it, the term we used, national identity, or the national like ethos or whatever, you know. Americans, we are very like giddy up and go, big, let's just punch them in the face once, bomb the hell out of them and take the oil kinds of people. So it's kind of cool, like, you know, in contrast, you know, with people who are like, all right, well, here's our history, and like, here's these pendulums, but they move in a almost a less dramatic fashion sometimes. It's a different way of doing things. I don't think would be half bad in this country.
Gosh, I wish that were me.
Yeah, look, that's really interesting.
Although I wouldn't trade places with you in Australia because, you know, we're hearing all these crazy stories, which I don't know if they're true or
Well,
not. But
this is where I think we're seeing the two different stereotypes play out, and just from I've got a dual perspective on this issue. My red, white, and blue blood that just configures itself half into a Union Jack and some stars, and the other one into, you know, the red, white, and blue stripes and a few more stars. David, our national apathy, I think, is going to bite us in the rear really hard. That's my perspective, and I think it's becoming increasingly obvious. We're not as dynamic and as volatile as Americans, and that's the history. You know, you guys have been in how many? We guys have been in how many wars, civil wars, fought for just about everything, rightly or wrongly, whatever. You know, it's a nation of fighters. General Patton's World War II speech, awesome. That is the American personality. You know, Australia's been a foreign participant in just about every single conflict that it's ever been a part of. It's never had a civil war. These are not faults. These are just things that inform its history. And so when it comes, what's very interesting is when it comes to taking a hard stand on any sort of principle, regardless of the moral or the weight, the gravity that goes along with it, we approach it in completely different ways. Whether it's the government mandating something and the social response to that. And that's not even something that I'm talking about with immediate relevance. That's just that the history of executive orders that have been implemented at a social level, we are extremely compliant. And there's a social calm that comes with that. You know, and you can sit back and you go, gee, I'd love to have that sort of laid back attitude. And I think there's definitely a point to that. But at the same time, the fact that these minorities that are so small can have such a dramatic effect is the biggest telltale sign that there is something really, really wrong with 99.99% of the population. And I think Australia is extremely vulnerable to that because of this. Even the good old days, what people loved about Australia was probably its relaxed attitude. There were definitely conservative values that we've lost, and I'm not sure. Yeah, you know, maybe that's just the natural byproduct of being confronted with the modern ideologies. Something's going to give, and where there's a moral vacuum, that's just going to fill it, and nothing really confronted it. But we're in a really, really interesting time where I think you're dead right. I think it's entirely possible that in the not too distant future will be a republic. Not that that has dramatic social effect, but it's just another snipping of a traditional linkage that we have. You look at the educational system and what constitutes education. That's not something that's exclusive to Australia. Everybody has eyes on America because America is the social media, the social, the fashion. It's the epicenter of the world, really. For I don't know how much longer, but that's just the way it is. You know, New York, Silicon Valley, Hollywood, all eyes are on America. But so long as there are people populating all the different areas of the globe, those people are going to be confronting the same issues, which are, we're people, we're complicated, we make moral choices. So we're going to be confronted with those choices on a day-to-day basis. And I see exactly the same battles being fought here, just with a different national personality, which makes the battle play out a little bit differently. And I think while it may have its strengths, it makes me worried.
Yeah. I fear for Australia as well, because we are a very relaxed and laid back people. And Tom rightly says that, after that initial colonization, which involved, sort of learning to live and overcome a very harsh and remote environment, we as a nation haven't really had to fight for much. And I think we've been a very successful nation and a very prosperous nation economically. And I think that, coupled with the fact that we've never really had to fight for something as a nation, has really, I think Australians have been morally corrupted because of it. And I think there's, because of the apathy, at least in the United States, as an outsider looking in, you see, yes, there are lots of bad actors, but there are lots of people there who are prepared to stand up and oppose that. There seems to be a lot more strength and conviction than you find in Australians generally. And yeah, I am a little bit fearful, just because we're a godless country now. All that morality that we had before, that did come from the Protestant and Catholic influence, has basically been eroded. And we're now looking at, it's like the Roman Empire sort of cannibalized itself in the end. It became decadent of its own success. And I see the same thing happening generally in the West as well. And Australia's at the front of that as well. I think especially New Zealand and Canada as well are in a lot of sense awful when it comes to politically. Australia's basically in the same boat, unfortunately.
Yeah. Man, I'm like, what we're gonna have to do, Rudy? We're just gonna have to get him back on at some point, aren't we?
I think so.
Oh, there's so much, but I know that if we keep talking, it'll end up being Tuesday, the day before our Monday. So so thank you both.
Oh, you have wives and a child as well.
I'm sure Jen's happy and being kept out of her hair. I don't know about Ashley, Rudy, but
she could take care of herself.
We're the heads of household. So
well, Sundays for the boys.
Yeah, that's right. It's Monday and Sunday, and that's we are so grateful for you guys to come on. You'll have to do so again, but this has been such a wonderful and engaging conversation, and it's good to have such strong bulwarks of the faith and a family life across the ocean from us. I think it's amazing how despite being separated by such distance, you can really feel like people are just sitting around the table with you. So thank you both so much. For our listeners, please go subscribe, like, comment, hit those bells, do everything that you can to support Lounge Room Chats. That is Tom's podcast, and Dave is the underpinning of that, probably the reason that you're still standing. So and what is the name of the website again? It's thecatholiccorner.com, or is it .org?
.org, thecatholiccorner.org. So we'll flick you the link, and if you want, you can include it.
We shall put it down below, down under, I should say. Haha. So if you liked this episode, and let's be honest, we know you did, besides going over and subscribing to our new friends channel, you could also be a subscriber of this channel, hit the notification bell, do all that kind of stuff. We're always pumping out really fun content. And if you have any episode suggestions for the future, we would love to hear them, or any questions that we need to ask these guys. For instance, what was up with the Emu War? That's when you knew that Australia probably lost the plot, right?
We'll have to whip out the history books for that one, Dave.
Oh, no. Oh, I'm just playing. I think that's everything, Rudy. Wouldn't you say?
I think so, yeah. Thank you so much for watching, and God bless you and may He keep you.
We'll see you on the next one. Adios.
God bless you both. Thank you.